Welcome to the session on the giants of Asia. So we've got three huge countries, economically and demographically speaking. We've got three very big speakers, intellectually speaking and prolifically in terms of their written word, and as I say, only 60 minutes. So quite a tall order that we have to address what is, I think, the great story of our age in many ways, this shift in economic power from west to east, from America and Europe, some see as the declining empires, to the rise of Asia. So an opportunity then to address that great shift and what are its implications. And clearly, there are many different aspects of it, the local aspects, the regional implications. Of course, we have the topical dispute over the East China Sea islands, which has obviously brought the whole China, Japan, Taiwan interrelationships into the forefront of the news, and I'm sure the speakers will comment on that. But there's also the broader global implications of this, the rise of the East, the decline of the West, and those are some of the broad themes which I'm sure will be touched on over the next period. So we have, I say, three huge speakers, intellectually speaking. First to be speaking will be Professor Emeritus Barry Buzan from LSE, a man of global reputation in the field of international relations. He retired last year from his position as professor at LSE, but he has taught, he has written, he has spoken at institutions, universities around the world. For those of you in the international relations field, he's very much associated with the English school as an alternative to the realist and the liberal schools. I say he's retired, he's Professor Emeritus, but that doesn't mean he's not doing an enormous amount of research, probably more research and more writing than he was able to do, and he's got a huge bibliography to his name if we look at the speakers' briefs that are on the website. He's working on a book at the moment, called, and amongst several, as he's informed me, on the global transformation. And one of the themes, I know, having heard some of the stuff recently, is on the theme of a world without superpowers, decentered globalism, and I'm sure he'll touch on that during the course of his few comments. Following Barry, we have Dr. Yeuh, who is an economist. She's a fellow in economics at Oxford University, director there of the China Growth Centre. I'm sure she's known to many of you as a commentator on many economic matters, frequently on BBC. She's, I think, the economics editor of Bloomberg TV, and also very widely published, not least in the area pertaining to this discussion. She has books to her name on the economy of China, the future of Asian trade and growth, globalization and economic growth in China. And finally, we have another professor, Professor James Woudhuysen. He's a professor of forecasting and innovation at Montfort University. And alongside his scholarly pursuits and his prolific writing, I think the latest publication to his name, or as a group, is Big Potatoes, a manifesto for innovation, which he's showing off to you now. But he's advised also, alongside his scholarly work and his written work, has advised many of the world's leading companies, Yamaha Motors, Philips, Ford, HP, IBM, over the years. So those are our three speakers. We have then an international relations expert, an economist, and an expert in innovation. So bound to be an interesting debate. We might not get to a complete synthesis of views over the course of the next 55 minutes, but we'll do what we can. So 5 minutes each from the speakers.
The big idea I want to look at in my 5 minutes is peaceful rise, which was a notion that emerged some years ago as a way of framing China's foreign policy and how it wanted to relate to the rest of the world and also to the rest of Asia. I'm down on record as thinking that this was a fairly brilliant idea, not just for moral reasons, but because it seemed to indicate an understanding of a number of fairly stark history lessons about non-peaceful rise. It seemed an extremely sensible way of approaching China's own needs for development. And it seemed also a pretty good way, if China took the United States as being its long-term rival, it seemed to me the best, most subtle, cleverest, and most risk-free way of cutting the legs off the American position in Asia. To rise peacefully, however, requires very careful control of foreign policy. Now, I think this peaceful rise idea worked pretty well up until about 2009. China cultivated a pretty good relationship with its neighbors. It was seen as a good neighbor by many of the ASEAN countries. The one exception here was its relationship with Japan, which has been neglected by both governments and which has always been rather sour. But both in a general sense, globally, and in a regional sense, and up until 2009, peaceful rise was going fairly well. Thereafter, however, there seems to have been a turn in Chinese foreign policy. This I see as something of a tragedy in some ways. Phil mentioned the latest version of this, or the latest manifestation of this, in the disputes over the islands in the East China Sea. But there's a lot of similar sorts of things. China has taken on a much more bullying aspect towards its neighbors in relation to border disputes with South Asia, maritime boundaries and island disputes in the South China Sea, a rather more unhelpful line on the environment. It even managed to pick a fight with South Korea, which had previously been quite friendly with it. And of course, over the last few years, there's also been a reasonable amount of crackdown on the more liberal elements in Chinese society. But alongside this, there is still a reasonable amount of behavior that would be consistent with peaceful rise. China is quite good at contributing to peacekeeping operations. It's become a member of the World Trade Organization. Its relations with Taiwan have got better. It's generally considered to be fairly responsible in terms of finance, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a puzzle here as to what happened to this peaceful rise policy, because the mix doesn't work. Right? China's neighbors are now concerned about China's rise. They are more fearful of it. And the oddity here is that the principal beneficiary of this shift in Chinese policy is the United States. The United States is now much more welcome in East and South Asia than it was before. The countries there are doing a bit more of the work of balancing China. So arms modernization and such like is going apace. There's a much more welcoming attitude towards the U.S. turn to Asia. And in general, all of this helps the position of the United States, which would otherwise be in decline. So China's behavior is being, in a sense, cheered by all of the hawks in Washington. They could love nothing more than the way China's policy is going. The puzzle here is why. I think it's always a mistake to say that, or to think that the Chinese government is stupid, because in general it's not. The only hypothesis that seems to find any support for explaining this is an odd one, which is that nobody is in control of China's foreign policy. This is a great peculiarity, because the one thing you expect from a country that labels itself communist is that there should be good central control over everything. But the foreign ministry is weak in China's power structure, and it seems lots of different agencies are making their own foreign policy, and that this incoherence is both undermining peaceful rise and playing to the great advantage of the United States in the Western Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry.
Well, 70 years ago, the Battle of Guadalcanal was in full force. It began on the 7th of August and was really concluded with a naval battle in November 1942. It was, after the Battle of Midway, aircraft carriers that were most important in the second half of the Pacific War. You can't reduce the Second World War to the Pacific War. The Sino-Japanese War was very important. And also what was important was MacArthur's code breakers, who established that Guadalcanal would not be defended. They were working in Melbourne. And I think if you look at cybersecurity today and China's plans to add 2 domestically built aircraft carriers to the Ukrainian one of dubious vintage that it's just launched 58,500 tons worth just in September, I think history never repeats itself, but the story of explosive tensions in the Pacific and in the East China Sea and the South China Sea is very much with us today. The fact that Christine Lagarde of the IMF can say that the dispute over the Senkaku or Yeuh Islands in the East China Sea is a threat to the world economy shows just how serious the whole area has become for us, even in Britain, and certainly for the contending powers in the region, most especially the United States, which is bound by a treaty with Japan to defend Japan's ownership of the Senkaku. It's also bound by treaties with Korea as part of the Western alliance there, and Korea itself is in dispute not just with China, interested to hear about that from Barry, but with Japan over the Dokdo Islands. You need an atlas for all of this. The CIA is the best source because it's not entirely clear to most people in this room where any of these islands are. And there's certainly nothing very much to do with the projections that are often made by our resource wars friends and the vulgar Marxists, so I think Barry is quite at pains to kick, including Fred Halliday, who's in his grave, but why not keep kicking him, who believe that resources and oil is really underneath these disputes. It isn't. There might be some oil, that's not the main event. Nor do I believe is nationalism the main driving force bringing about these disputes. It is important. It is probably growing. It is quite a top-down phenomenon in Japan and China, but it cannot be compared with the passions that preceded the Second World War. And it's quite important to work out just how much nationalism is talked up by Western reporters who notice a lot of people taking photographs with their mobiles, and just how much it's really felt. It is felt in China because of the legacy of the Sino-Japanese War, but we need to get it in proportion. So what is it about these island disputes? The main thing is that trade routes are more important than resources, and more important and nationalism, and more important even than trade routes is just the whole history of the 20th century for Asia, which is one of explosive growth and unresolved tensions, and therefore continuing callbacks to history and fierce antagonisms to do with just who is going to own the future in Asia, which is going to determine the future of the world. This is the Asian century. I think what Barry underestimates, although he's right to attack Fred Halliday, is the decline of the US in this whole picture. The decline of the US has made the US come back on the block with Obama's pivot to Asia in October of last year. And although it may be true that China is not doing itself any favors with American hawks by its more aggressive outlook today, nevertheless, the decline of the US is, and its attempt to get round that by getting as many allies as it can, or all back, is a bit of a problem for exacerbating regional tensions. I think, moving on from the island disputes, the striking thing about the three countries, despite their very different regimes, is how sclerotic and out of touch with their populaces they all are. Manmohan Singh has finally woken up to the legendary possibilities of Tesco coming to India, which is obviously going to unlock the Indian economy about 20 years since he first unlocked it in the wake of the end of the Cold War. Whether he actually goes through with that and waves bye-bye to the Kirana stores, which occupy every street corner in India and are the bedrock for the BJP's politics, is another question. In Japan, they've had the lost decade, then they kind of got it back a little bit, now they're back in a lost decade, really. Insofar as they've got out of it, it's largely been to do with China. Mr. Noda has about 25% support in the polls, and that's one of the reasons why they're having to play up nationalism from the top down so much, and indeed one of the reasons why Shinzo Abe was at the Yasukuni Shrine in a delightfully diplomatic move, stroking war criminals just on the 17th of October. Of course, that didn't go down very well in Beijing. It's a reflection of the political problems that they have in Japan. Now, you might say China's very different. They've got 60 million members of the Chinese Communist Party there, so they're not going to give up in a whole hurry. But I think the fact that the president-elect Xi Jinping goes missing for 10 days because one of his vertebrae went missing does indicate that they are just not in control of events. And I fully agree with Barry on the foreign policy thing, that they're not in control of foreign policy, they're not in control of events, And there's still a whole lot of turmoil in the Chinese Communist Party leadership. Their experience in Myanmar, or Burma as we know it, has not been very happy, and they're in a mess. All of this is a big contrast to the explosive dynamism of China, which still is there. Even India and even Japan, if you look at its living standards, they've got a whole lot to play for, and they're all messing it up, and that's what explains the tensions today.
Thank you, James. Linda.
Thank you very much. I think in my 5 minutes, I'm going to focus on a bit about the economic rise and how sustainable it is for the region. Now, I'm going to focus a great deal on the billion-plus countries of China and India. In the description, of course, it also refers to Japan. At first, when I saw the description of the session, and I thought, a giant of Asia, Japan. Not something I would have normally thought, but I think we can talk about it in the discussion. But I think in terms of the dynamism and where the growth is coming from, I'm going to focus a great deal on China as really having established itself as the driver, not just for the region, but also for global growth, but also a lot of the issues that it's going to have to face in the coming years. To me, the test of whether or not you can call these economies real economic engines actually came 4 years ago during the global financial crisis. Sometimes when you're an economist who does commentating, you go on TV, you say a few things, you walk off, and you think, well, that was my 3 minutes. I said my bit, I'm off. The BBC caught me after one of these things and said, do you want to put in writing what you just said? And I thought, ooh, this is not a good idea. And it had to do with whether or not China could be an engine of growth as the West was melting down. And in fact, that is actually what I had written, which is to some extent, China had decoupled from the West in the sense of, after 30 years of reform, finally having a middle class that could sustain a rate of growth, not as fast as it could if it could also sell to the West, but enough of a middle class so that it could grow and not fall into significant recession with the Western meltdown. And that article appeared on the BBC website, and I've been holding my breath ever since. And what was interesting was it turned out that China did indeed manage not to go into a recession, even though the West was on the brink of meltdown. But not just China, India and Indonesia. That was the third country I would have picked in the region as having real dynamism, especially in Southeast Asia. And the reason is very simple in many ways, because Indonesia has a population of about 240 million. That was the size of what the United States was in 1980, when it was the main engine of global economic growth. So it's the size of these economies which is extraordinary. And after finally emerging and gaining a reasonable income level over the past couple of decades, they're now in a place to have a middle class to sustain domestic demand, even as their export-oriented strategies begin to fall away because of problems in the West. So these countries not falling into recession, that was what was significant. And what was also surprising was they helped countries like Australia and Canada. Australia didn't even experience a technical recession, which was incredible considering how the West fared 4 years ago. So to me, those are the kinds of indicators that really do matter. And I suppose a longer-term perspective on this is that Asia comprises about 50% of the world's population. It shouldn't be surprising that they ought to comprise about that share of global GDP, given that GDP output is just what every person produces. In fact, it wouldn't be surprising, and it wouldn't be ahistorical, because in the 19th century, in the work of Angus Maddison, the economic historian, Asia did actually account for a share of global GDP, which is roughly commensurate with its population. And that's why Asia was the dominant region in the world in the beginning of the 19th century. And then lots of reasons followed for their decline. But let me just focus a little bit on China in terms of being both already the largest engine of growth in the world, and actually it's been as important as the U.S. since 1980. And part of this shouldn't be surprising, given that it's catching up, so therefore it can actually grow faster. But I think one of the statistics that really struck me is that China and the U.S. and Germany, they each account for 10% of global trade. Japan counts for just under 5%. These four countries account for over a third of global trade. They already are the dominant players in how global trade flows and global GDP evolve. And what's unusual, of course, is that China is still a poor country. To have a significant engine of growth where average incomes in that country are $5,000 US puts it into a very different world economy than one one that we can recall or have experienced. China's growth has been remarkable. 660 million people lifted out of abject poverty. But what it faces now is the biggest challenge it's faced really since emerging out of central planning. So first 30 years, remarkable growth, but a lot of it were almost like low-hanging fruit. When you give people incentives and you reward productivity, that transformation is not just seen in China, but seen in other places. What it faces in the next 30 years is how to join the ranks of rich countries and overcome the middle-income country trap. So in other words, once incomes hit about 14,000 US dollars, adjusted for purchasing power, economies slow down considerably. They plateau. There's only been a handful of countries that have joined the ranks of rich countries, emerging from development status. And if China were able to do that over the next couple of decades, then it can truly be an engine of growth. And I think that would help establish the giants of Asia. I'm out of time, so let me just finish with this. There's a lot of people who query whether China can do this. You do need to become much more innovative. You need to have companies which are world beaters. You need to have people who are ready to put in R&D and create the most extraordinary things. So I'm just going to end with how fast things can actually change. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox. For those of you who are, well, I was going to say this is an 80s movie, so I have to be very careful here in terms of the younger people who, if you haven't seen it, it's a great classic. But basically, Michael J. Fox goes back to the 1950s, and he's trying to get his... I know. You haven't seen it. It's a great classic. He goes back to the 50s, and he's trying to get his parents to go back together. He's traveling back from the future. And the scientist he meets goes, I don't believe you're from the future. Tell me something from the future. And he said, well, Ronald Reagan is president. And the scientist says, oh, my God, a B-movie actor is president of the United States? You're not from the future. And then tell me something else. So Michael J. Fox says, Japan makes the best things I own, in terms of TVs, in terms of cars. And the scientist says, you are definitely not from the future. Made in Japan is just like made in China today. And that, to me, is an indicator of why it's difficult to predict the future. Thank you.
Okay, well, if I could throw one question up, which hopefully links together what some of you were saying, but perhaps on Japan, as you've ended with Japan in a sort of oblique way, and Linda was saying, I wasn't really going to focus on Japan. It's more about India and Indonesia and China in particular. But Japan remains, the third largest economy in the world, the second biggest industrial economy. It still has very high quality goods. It still is seen as a leader in many areas. And Barry, when you were looking at the Japan-China tension at the moment, you seem to be, well, you were very directly saying it's more a sign of problems within China, whereas the commentary on what's going on at the moment, saying it's, and I think this relates to James's point on the sort of sclerosis or difficulties that the political elites have, say focusing on Japan, that actually the provocation around the islands in some commentary has come more out of Japan and being a symptom of Japanese problems today, Japanese political problems, which may be a reflection of economic decline as well, but more a reflection of a region which is becoming more out of control, shall we say, rather than putting the onus just on China's difficulties of managing its relationship. So perhaps, Barry, on that, the other side of it, the broader part.
I mean, that links to what James was saying about the sources of these disputes. And I somewhat agree with his analysis. I don't think it's resources. I don't think it's so much nationalism. In part, it's history. But history doesn't explain it all, because the big history problems are in Northeast Asia amongst China, Japan, and Korea. It's not the only thing the two Koreas agree on is that they don't like Japan, basically. But there's a structural and very striking similarity between the island disputes that go all the way from the ones between China and Russia up in the north down into the South China Sea between China and various of the bordering countries down there. And those are not affected in the same way by the history question. It seems to me there's a kind of, I don't know, that there's an obsession with what I would call territoriality, which is perhaps reminiscent of the way Europeans used to be obsessed with territoriality. Remember Alsace-Lorraine? Those of you who are old enough to remember Alsace-Lorraine, probably nobody in the room. But, causes of the Second World War and all of that. So this kind of thing, it seems to me, is also an important variable. I wouldn't blame either the Chinese or the Japanese exclusively for the current dispute. I think they're equally culpable in different ways. The Japanese have stuck their heads in the sand and refused to deal with the history issue. The Chinese have taken the opposite view and have cultivated, with the patriotic education campaigns, they've cultivated a form of nationalism which has anti-Japaneseness built into it, and they're now paying the price for that.
James, you put an onus on American decline as being an underpinning or a root of some of these changes of what's going on in the region. What do you make of Barry's point that, ironically, what's happening in the region at the moment in terms of the difficulties China has as pursuing its peaceful rise perspective is actually opening up opportunities for the United States, and it's actually a way in which the United States is able to retain its great power role in the region?
Well, it's very rare at the Battle of Ideas for anybody to agree on anything, but I do agree a little bit with Barry on this point. It's not a mutual appreciation society. I think China isn't doing itself any favors through its string of pearls strategy in annoying Korea, as he says, obviously Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, lots of other people, and that does open the door for American foreign policy. I think what Barry might or might not agree with is whether China has any choice in the matter. Because, one of the canards that's still made, to my surprise, about the region is, look, Japan and China are trading enormously with each other. There'll never be a war. And that was, of course, said between Britain and Germany before the First World War. So, the fact of dense economic relations and the fact equally that China's not doing itself any favors by stomping around in the newer way that it is doing a bit. I don't think you can compare China's behavior with America's, but nevertheless China is quote-unquote more aggressive nowadays. Nevertheless, what choice does it have? It sees itself as encircled. It sees the tourism of Hillary Clinton walking around everywhere saying the United States has a strategic interest in basically stopping China's naval access and its trade access to the maritime routes of the region. I think rather than an obsession with territoriality, I'm not sure about that. I do remember that the last President of France, what was his name? Sarkozy. Yes, he was in Alsace-Lorraine, didn't know where he was, if you remember. But I don't think it's so much territoriality as the fact that they can't easily lose face in the whole region. And although Western people go on too much about, inscrutable Japanese, inscrutable Chinese, not wanting to lose face, I think, when you've got all these warships going around these stupid islands which are just full of trees and half a duck, it's clear that it's not a material issue. It is to do with diplomatic postures, to do with how it plays back at home, and these kinds of things. And therefore, I don't see it so much as to do with territory as to do with the whole political situation domestically. Now, here there is a big difference, which is that the Japanese working class is still to recover from the defeats of the 40s and the 50s and the whole MacArthur period and the Cold War. If you look at the Chinese and Indian working class, it's very much on the move. And in this respect, Japan doing the tactics that it is, I agree with Barry, you can't easily assign blame for who started it, which isn't a proper criterion for any war, nor for the Senkaku dispute. But nevertheless, Japan's willingness to go out on a limb when it's facing little domestic pressure from the working class, despite the unpopularity of the regime, is an interesting wrinkle in the whole process.
Linda, there's an interesting parallel I find between what you and Barry were saying in terms of the times ahead are going to become a bit more problematic than what we've seen before. I mean, Barry's stressing the sort of the international relations elements, would say, in terms of peaceful rise has worked very well for a period and it's becoming more problematic. And you describing the way that the growth, the economic development in China has gone, pretty smoothly up to now, but now we're in this, middle-income trap. Is it going to be able to make the next transition? Could I push you a bit on how you see the links between those? I mean, do you see the sort of the difficulties which you anticipate on the economic front in China having, international or at least regional implications in terms of where it sees itself? Do you see that making it become more aggressive, more reclusive, more inward-looking, more outward-looking? How do you see it?
There's a great analogy that was actually told to me by a Chinese official. And what she said was, China on the world stage, it's kind of like China finds itself on the stage, but its back is turned to the audience. Because in China, they're really focused on internal development. So they don't recognize necessarily the global impact of what they do sufficiently. And over the past few years, that's begun to change. But I defer to Barry on this. I think there is, and I agree, there's a certain lack of coherence in the way that they've positioned it. But that's the reason. So, for instance, China's goal is to increase economic growth and make sure that its economy continues to achieve a reasonable rate of growth in the coming decades. And to do that, they do need to have global market access, because that's what gives them competitiveness and allows their firms to upgrade. So just to give you the trajectory they're talking about, China's going to slow in terms of its economy in the next decade. There's no serious economist who doesn't think it's going to slow. The question is by how much. So say China slows down to growing by an average of 7%, its income will actually double by 2020, because a rule of thumb is you take the number 70, you divide it by the growth rate, and that gives you the number of years an economy doubles in size. James says I do a lot of numbers in my tweets. I do a lot of numbers generally. So therefore, by 2020, even if growth slows that substantially, incomes will double. So that means on a PPP basis, they've already hit the middle income country trap level. And they know that after 2020, that's when the challenges emerge. So how can they actually overcome the middle income country trap, something which lots of countries can't? They need to have globally competitive companies. So that means companies which are multinationals, companies which follow in the footsteps like the Japanese, like the Koreans, having companies which could compete on a global stage. They need to have the global policy to support that. So in other words, Chinese firms investing commercially overseas. This is a new policy. It only started in the year 2000, and we already begin to see that coming out in Europe and in the US. So even though China, up until this point, never really considered, for instance, how its state-owned enterprises investing in resources, or how its need to secure what they call energy security by having trade routes protected and the string of pearls policy. Now it's forced upon them because their companies have to go into overseas markets, and the backlash against their overseas investment is going to be a serious concern for China, because in order to upgrade, they need to have the Sonys and the Samsungs of the world, and they can only do that if they continue to catch up and also invest in innovation. So lots of people talk about the worries of protectionism. To me, that's actually the biggest worry, and if this hits China, its growth will slow substantially. It also has knock-on effects, because it's now the biggest engine of global growth. Given the problems in the West, it would also slow down the global economy. So I think now there's a forced engagement between China and the West, not just on economic policy, but on a range of things, because China can't continue to have its back to the audience on the world stage.
Okay, thanks. Okay, before I come over to you, James just nudged me and said he'd like to make a few comments on that, and then questions and comments from the floor, please.
Well, I'm rather amused by Linda's comments. The only thing that's really vindicating her position on Japan being out and Indonesia surpassing it, you seem to be intimating, is, the fate of Sony, which is actually completely a basket case. There's no doubt of that. So why you put them in the same league as Samsung, which, hooray, has just beaten Apple in the latest court dispute, I don't know. But I think Japan is not that completely down and out. If you take the R&D numbers, which are so critical to the whole area, because Asia is becoming the locus for innovation in the world, you'll find that Japan is still very far ahead of all the other countries, and that China is having some difficulty getting its R&D expenditure up to that level. Nevertheless, in fact, China's R&D expenditures are rising very fast, and not only that, it's now beginning to acquire, through foreign direct investment, research capabilities in America and shortly in Europe. I do think Linda's quite right about the protectionist threat to China. I think that will definitely impede its rise around the world. But I think that it's too early by far to write Japan off. And it's wrong, I think, of other commentators to suggest, as is so happily done in the West, that China's still on the path of imitating us and all of these things. If you look at what's happening in Chinese research and development, especially in the energy field, partly because they're driven by concerns of energy security, it's true that Chinese solar panel makers have gone down the tube. The whole solar industry is very similar to Solyndra in the United States there. But nevertheless, in all energy technologies, China is ahead of the West and was announced as that by Jeffrey Immelt, the head of General Electric, 2 or 3 years ago. So that's a very critical area. It does need these resources from Africa and everywhere else, but in the realm of innovation, China is moving ahead very sharply and is no match for Japan, but certainly way ahead of Indonesia now and for the next 10 years.
Can I just clarify something?
Of course you can.
When Sony became a world-beating company, that was when Japan started to really emerge. And then Samsung wasn't a very strongly known brand, for instance, or Hyundai cars, but they've obviously then emerged and become innovative. So it's that ability to create multinational companies that can compete with the West. That's the indicator. Companies, of course, have rises and falls, and it's symptomatic of a country that's able to join the ranks of rich countries to even create those companies in the first place. The reason why I placed Indonesia over Japan is that it's in the context of the last crisis. Japan hasn't had a very good crisis. Indonesia, as a bulwark for the region, has actually been surprising, I think, in many ways, in terms of being resilient. And if you look ahead to what countries are likely to drive global growth, I would say Southeast Asia, China and India have a better chance of it than countries affected by the financial crisis, which I do include Japan. And this is why you have, I think, perhaps a bifurcation, which is right, in terms of thinking about Asia as developing Asia versus just Asia as a whole. And I always find Japan sits very oddly in that. But I wouldn't write off any country personally. I've been to Japan recently. Their stagnation has the pretty good standard of living attached to it. So.
It's a stagnation we'd love to have.
Exactly. So
I'd just say two things. One, I think, expect vast amounts of hypocrisy out of the United States about other people's aircraft carriers. I mean, count the number of aircraft carriers that they have. If the Chinese want to waste their money on having 3 aircraft carriers, that's fine with me. The other thing I think, just to correct a point from James, is that I wasn't saying that it's territory that's important, but territoriality, right? That the territoriality is the symbolic principle of the attachment of the nation to the territory. Right? And this played very big in Europe. It was invented in the 19th century, and it makes the territory sacred. Right? And it gives a very peculiar aspect to territoriality that wasn't there before nationalism was invented and produced this effect. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in Asia, that nationalism and the feelings about history are tied to territoriality. It's the only thing to me that explains the symbolic importance of this, because I agree with you that the resource issues and other such like are relatively trivial. I mean, just to take the dispute between Japan and China, I mean, whatever is underneath the seabed around those islands and whatever fish are in the waters is totally inconsequential in terms of the relation between China and Japan and their trade and investment relations. So it just isn't this. Right? It's got to be that there's some kind of crazy symbolic importance that is driving all of the emotionalism about this. And you can't deny that the emotionalism is there, and that's the problem.
I'd be really interested in hearing what the panel thinks about the role of the domestic politics and basically the massive population in the future in Asia, and especially the bigger countries. Because I think that what you've tended to see, there's a lot of focus on economic policy, international relations. What does the current political leadership think? And you can kind of think about where is the trajectory of things going. But I wonder if there's a kind of wild card in all this is really what's going to happen in domestic politics? How would, in particular the mass of people, will they start to insist on changes? I think we in the West, are used to, in a way, to kind of put it in a phrase, the working class is off the stage of history, right? We're very pessimistic in a lot of ways about potential for change. There's a lot of cultural views around that's pessimistic about the potential for growth. We're kind of down on what growth could be. But I'm wondering if we maybe project that onto into Asia and the East and whether, you know, it's possible that, that this could, as I said, kind of like the wild card could be that this could change the dynamic in the region at all.
I want to know from the panel, what is the real effective impact of the West's inability and sort of stupefaction and paralysis in the face of its economic crisis? Because Linda pointed out that, you know, the trade balance with the West is not unimportant to China's orientation towards both its foreign policy and its domestic policy. So in broad terms, is not the flip side or the shadow side of this whole discussion very much to do with the paralysis of the West in terms of its response to its own economic crisis? And I mean, that's basically the point. All this stuff about inter-regional conflict and tension, can it not be broadened out to understand it as a kind of fractured response to how to deal or not deal with the West's inability to deal with its own problems?
On the question of territoriality, I wouldn't have to go back to Alsace-Lorraine. Look at the Israelis and the Palestinians who have the same problem, and also partly because of the invention of nationalism. They can't settle their dispute in a sensible way by cutting the country up in two in a sensible way. Secondly, a question, though, for China and Japan. Am I not right, perhaps Linda, that in fact they don't allow much immigration, and there's still a very, very strong racialism, to be frank about it all. And this is what turning your back to the audience is about, I think. You're still the Middle Kingdom, you're still the centre of the world. And isn't there a huge problem to come here? And the whole question, which nobody talked about, which is the whole question of democratization and the quality of Japan's democracy or lack of it.
You know, James, you started us off Guadalcanal and Battle of Midway. Barry, you've talked about the aircraft carriers. Is the fourth Asian giant in this area not America? I mean, has there been any decoupling? Have you got this right, Linda? Because we have an Asian pivot, we also have a Buy America program, a manufacturing surge pushed by Obama, and I would think a very clear territoriality about the Pacific, you know, America's backyard, which has always been there. And I raise that slightly because the middle income trap you describe, I think, is also in relationship to the pre-existing, very powerful countries in the world that have a certain interest in some countries not getting out of that. Japan has historically been the exception, allowed out of it as a post-Cold War projection of American power into its Pacific backyard, and played a very clear role in that, was reconstructed to provide that. If you take that on board now, is it not an existentialist crisis that Japan is suffering rather than an economic one? The floundering around over tiny islands, turtles, and James's half a duck. You know, that's a kind of dangerous, incoherent. Maybe it mirrors the Chinese incoherence, also asking what are they for. But it must be more profound in a Japan that's been cut loose from an American post-war order, maybe even like Israel, equally floundering to say what is it for. Put all that together in the Pacific, that's a sort of a fraught sea, turmoil, you know, kettle of danger. I'll stop the metaphors before I make turtle soup, but, you know, what do you think?
I'll take on two of those. The first one about the role of the mass of the population. I think that's a very interesting question in relation to China. One of the things that disturbs me most about China is the growing, and I'm going to use a nice old-fashioned Marxist concept, the growing contradiction between, on the one hand, the very successful economic reforms that the government has been pursuing, the last 3 decades, and on the other hand, the palpably capitalist society that is beginning to emerge in China. You don't have to walk around on the streets of Shanghai for more than 5 minutes to see that you're in the middle of a capitalist society. What's disturbing is that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't seem to get this link and feels very threatened by the emergence of a capitalist society. Capitalist societies are noisy, fractious, well-informed, well-resourced, turbulent places, and the Communist Party doesn't feel at all comfortable with that kind of society. That, it seems to me, is the very big question in Chinese domestic politics, is how the party is going to come to terms with the capitalist society that its own economic reforms are creating, but which also threaten it. Can the Chinese Communist Party, having invented the great oxymoron of market communism, can it actually go one step further and do a second great oxymoron of pluralist communism. I hope it can. Otherwise, there's going to be domestic trouble in China. On the last question as to whether the U.S. is part of Asia, I'm going to be a bit technical here. It seems to me that the U.S. has to be seen as an intervening outside power on the grounds that the U.S. can either leave or be thrown out of Asia in a way that China, Japan, and India cannot. Right? So one of the particular clever aspects of American superpowerdom, a work of genius, I think, in diplomatic terms, has been that the Americans have invented a number of meta-regional concepts which legitimize their presence in a variety of other places. I'm thinking here of Asia-Pacific, which seems to make America part of East Asia, of the Atlantic community, which seems to make America part of Europe, of the Americas, or the Western Hemisphere, which seems to make America part of Latin America. These have been extraordinarily clever, extraordinarily effective, symbolic political constructions which have helped America's superpower position over the last several decades. Interestingly, the only place they didn't do this was the Middle East. There's no kind of, where America has been equally much engaged, but they've never made that kind of construct to cover their own position in the Middle East, and therefore they are more obviously there an intervening outside power.
Well, I'm surprised to hear that America can quit the Pacific or Asia. You know, I know that Mitt Romney and Barack Obama look forward to energy autarky in the United States. But autarky and withdrawal from Asia is just not a possibility for American imperialism. And that's why they've done the pivot towards Asia, because they fully recognize that they've got to be a player there. Now, on the question that raised at the back about the domestic populations, I think the working class is important. I think the middle class is important. And I do agree with Barry that you know, the Chinese Communist Party has basically lost the confidence of the Chinese middle class. There's no doubt about that. And I think it's amazing it hasn't been mentioned so far, but the Bo Xilai affair, Mr. Bo, you know, has really been a big shake-up for everybody, you know, for the party, but also for the masses. And why are you going to give them any more legitimacy after that than if you're a Chinese? I think a particular place to look carefully at and be interested to hear what Linda and Barry have to say about this is Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a big template and a laboratory for experimentation by the Chinese Communist Party, and they're not having a very nice time of it at the moment. You know, the protests against the educational policies are intense, and you know they've had to get on the back foot. Now, I think Angus in the audience there makes a very good point. You know, I don't agree with Linda that there is such a thing necessarily as a middle-income trap. Any more than I get very interested in Angus Maddison, who's a brilliant economist, going on about China being the centre of the universe in the 19th century. I think these are two schematic views about the world economy for the future. But I do agree with Angus that, you know, America has a vested interest in ensuring that if there is a middle-income trap, you know, China falls into it and that it does not really rival America in terms of its global economic clout.
Whether it exists or not, it's the case that lots of countries haven't joined the ranks of rich countries. I've recently come back from Latin America, and they're the countries which are often used as examples. And in terms of China wanting to join the ranks of rich countries, that is certainly something that's built into their upcoming plans. And another way to think about it is that countries can only grow so well without innovation. At some point, when you stop being able to grow by increasing your factors, capital or labor, you have to get more out of those factors. And that's the point at which you have a turning of your growth model from catching up to being much more innovative. So there's more technical ways to describe it, but I actually rather like the middle-income country trap because I think it captures the frustration lots of developing countries have had in the post-war period, where they can grow very quickly for a time, but they just don't seem to be able to break into the standards of living that we enjoy in the West. And I think that is a huge challenge for lots of these countries. Would the West suppress China? I have no doubt that when I go and I speak in America and I say it's a good thing to have lots of poles of growth in the world economy, it's terrible to be the world's only economic superpower. I don't get a great reception, but it's true. You don't want to be the country where you set your interest rates and everyone goes, oh my God, you're starting a currency war. Well, actually, it's because, no, you're starting, you know. So anyway, so I think there's a bit of adjustment there. And just very quickly on some of the other points. I used to talk a lot more about political change in China and how it was repressed by Tiananmen Square, the kind of the scarring on a generation in terms of seeing economic liberalism with opening up with much more political opening. But then one of my students said in one of my classes, he raised his hand after I gave that answer, and he goes, yeah, well, I don't mean your generation. I mean the young people who are the movers and shakers. How do they feel about political change? So I don't know. So anyway, so I've stopped commenting on that. So.
Okay.
It's a question on the Beijing consensus, really, because it does seem that since Obama's election, the Washington consensus has shifted, so that rather than seeing China as a problem and being talked up as a threat to America's leadership of the world, which is what happened under Bush, now you've got people turning around and accusing Obama of being soft on China and letting it get away with quite a lot. My question is, has there been a shift in the Beijing consensus in which they were saying that, well, actually, China is capable of growing within the world and doing it quite harmoniously and it being a boost for everyone? And I'm just wondering, given what's going on more recently, has that discussion and that presentation of itself to the world shifted?
Yeah, I agree with the long-term growth prospects for the obvious giants of Asia, but I do think that we're entering a really tricky period. And I don't think you can look at the resilience of China in the 2008-9 crisis and project that forward. I think the massive reflation, the massive stimulus that they engaged in to keep growth going, they cannot repeat. It's very clear. And looking at the growth now, exports have come down, imports have come down, and it's not consumption that's picked up, it's investment. So the so-called middle class isn't really coming out and starting to shop. So that rebalancing from exports and investment to middle-class consumption isn't happening. And I think that's a much more difficult thing. Similarly with India, I mean, India has got the most peculiar development of all these countries. It basically didn't really manage to get their land reform going. Agriculture is a mess. They never really got manufacture, except that they have these multinationals, you know, that own half of European steel industry and so on. And they've got this massively productive services. And they realize they've got to go back and sort out agriculture, because otherwise they'll have all these people pouring into the cities and what to do with that. So I think the issues are really huge. And it's going to be a very tricky decade ahead with global growth slowing because of developed markets' growth problems.
I just want to be kind of quite egotistical, and there's one point here in this discussion that I'm missing, and that's how does this all affect me and us in Europe? We've talked about the American century a little bit, and obviously the American century had a great influence politically and culturally, but how is this Asian century now going to affect us? And there are two sort of thoughts I had on this. There was, I think, a few months ago a Chinese hedge fund guy on Channel 4 News who told all of us that we should whinge less and work a bit more and pay off our debts, because, of course, the Chinese are the great creditor nation, so they can tell us, quite frankly, what to do. And that didn't go down well, needless to say. And the other thought I had on this is whenever a Chinese company in particular, or anybody from Asia, is trying to take over a European company, there tends to be negative voices around this. Just look at the football clubs here. Whenever they are being bought by Asians, or at least have Asian investments, the voices aren't great around it. So I think there's still a lot of, I'm not going to say mistrust, but a lot of uncertainty about how the Asian century is going to affect us.
You've talked a lot about China, India, Japan, and Indonesia. These are huge countries with humongous populations. What about other countries in the area, in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Malaysia, even Singapore, even though it's developed? They have smaller populations, and with these larger kind of bullying policy that you mentioned from China, is there room for these countries to grow? Is there room for these countries to, even though they're kind of late to the party, is there still room for them to develop and become regional, have regional influence? And also, you've mentioned that with Hong Kong, for instance, it's a much more open society. And I have relatives in Hong Kong who are very interested in Japanese culture. A lot of the foreign students here from Asian countries are much more open, more curious about the world than people who moved abroad 30 or 40 years ago. So do you think the populace in general is becoming more, the urban populace, becoming more educated and more open and less nationalistic? And if so, do you think the government will follow suit in the end?
I don't think you've talked enough about the possibility for cooperation amongst these massive powers in Asia, because I read recently that India and China have signed an agreement not to outbid one another in third-party countries. That's quite an extraordinary thing for two big rival powers to do. And probably the most scariest thing from a Western viewpoint is that if they get their act together and you have where Asia dominates the world's production and consumption at the same time, and how is the West going to deal with that?
I'm a little bit surprised that demographics is not mentioned here, because if we were to talk about growth engine, the demographic profile of China is very different to that of India and Indonesia. That is a time bomb, and to what I see, the biggest challenge China is going to face, which is, the cost of generations of one-child policy. Going for, this is somewhat overlooked present because there has been this staggered sort of growth in China. You've got the tier 1 growth and the tier 2, tier 3 city growth. So it's been growth stories all along, overshadowing this problem that we have, which is demographic profile.
Let me just address that demography question first. I think it is an issue in terms of the aging population in China, specifically, not just for growth, but also obviously for pension provision and for equity and stability. And I think one of the challenges is for China now is that even if they were to dismantle the one-child policy, when they're beginning to, in terms of experimenting, if you're both coming from one-child families, you can have a second child. The results are it's actually very difficult to create more children. And you see this in other countries where once you hit a certain level of development, fertility rates tend to fall. So I agree it is an issue, and it's not clear to me how that will actually be resolved. In terms of the comment here about it being a tricky period, I certainly would agree with that. In terms of, I think the important thing to think about China's current slowdown is that if they wanted to, they could stimulate with consequence and boost the growth rate back up to 8 to 9%. But the issue is they don't want to, because the growth rate, as I suggested earlier, for the next trend growth rate, what's normal for them, is going to be about 7%. The goal for this year is 7.5%. The economy is now growing at about 7.5%. So it's a structural slowdown. It's not really a cyclical one, and whether they can sustain that, of course, is the issue everybody is looking at. But with interest rate at 6%, they still have a great deal of scope to stimulate if they wanted to. Government spending is small as a share of GDP, it's only 20%. There's lots of things they could do. Just very finally, because I'm out of time, is on Southeast Asia and how it affects Europe. I'm just going to make one point on both of those. Southeast Asia is thinking about creating an Asian single market, like Europe. And it's actually very good, because this means they can garner 500 million people into a single market. What they don't want to do is to adopt a single currency. And then finally, for Europe, this is good. I think what Europe needs is competition. I think Europe needs to realize that the potential here is not lost. It needs competition just to recognize that in this world of very big, giant economies and markets, we need to make sure that our productivity and our capacity is fully utilized. And it's a very positive thing to see this competitiveness come through. And as these markets get established, there are new markets to sell to, the kind of stuff that we produce. To me, it's a very positive sign that Asia is emerging, and I can see this century having a stronger growth rate than what we've seen in the last couple of decades for that reason.
How does it hit us here? Well, Greens are very worried about China participating in Britain's nuclear program. If there was a nuclear program, it might be a worry, but there isn't much of one. But it's already hitting us. And Huawei, as in have it Huawei, is already feared in terms of messing up our cybersecurity. I think one thing that Japan has going for it is that its Gini coefficient of inequality is not nearly what it is in India and China. Japan, the richest are 7 times richer than the poorest in Japan. That's nothing compared with the other places. I think the medium-term prospect in China is for a lot of turmoil. We've got some turmoil there already. I think the country really to watch for turmoil, though, is India right now. I think all this stuff about the world's largest democracy, it's for the birds. There is going to be a great amount of violence breaking out there over the next few years on all kinds of axes.
I'll just take the first question about the Beijing consensus and whether that's still the line. As far as I'm aware, it still is the line. That basically, if you look at what the Chinese leadership says, they go on and on about, China's got so many problems of its own, which is of course true, and that if China can develop itself, this is a fifth of humanity, and therefore a developing China will be good for everybody else because there'll be more science, more trade, more money, more everything, blah, 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 blah. That's still the basic line. The problem with this line is that it means that the Chinese are not at all thinking about how to engage themselves in international society, or indeed about what kind of international society they actually want to be part of. So we still don't know the answer to that question. And if with great power goes great responsibility, if I can use a pop phrase, then the Chinese are not yet caught up. They're beginning to have the great power, but they haven't yet got a good grip on what kind of responsibility goes with that, and they need to think a lot harder about this.
Okay, can we thank our panel, please? Thank you.